Hi there. Welcome to today's talk. Let us talk savings in the kitchen. I am Dr. Anne Marie Gloucester. I'm an associate professor in the Food Systems, Nutrition, and Health program at the University of Washington on the Seattle campus. Just a little bit about me. As I said, I am currently a professor and I have been a registered dietitian for over 3 decades now. My entire teaching focus has been around culinary nutrition science or culinary nutrition education. And I am a firm believer of having functional kitchen systems and developing good healthy habits with that. Finding economical strategies are super important to me, hence my dedication of this talk to my dad, who just turned 86 this month, and who basically taught me how to be very frugal and think about cost benefit savings and apply these to all of my consumer decisions. So, just a second to kind of think about the inspiration for this talk. It really happened last fall when, once again, for the second year in a row, egg prices started to go through the roof. So this is a slide that I created for my students explaining why this was happening, because eggs are one of the great sources of inexpensive protein that our student populations and people all over the world have used in times of economical hardship. But last year and ongoing now, we are losing a significant proportion of our flocks that are laying hens to the avian bird flu. And what happens is, avian flu, once it's found, they have to cull all of the birds and they won't end up producing eggs. It takes just 6 to 8 weeks to go from a chick to a meat bird. So within 6 to 8 weeks, a bird that has been raised for meat is processed. But it takes 6 months to get a laying hen to start laying eggs. So you have to put a lot more care and feeding into a laying hen before you can end up getting eggs. So what I wanted to look at when I convert this, thinking about it in terms of economics, one large egg has 7 grams of protein. Any ounce of beef, chicken, pork, or fish, or other protein sources, also has 7 grams of protein. So when you look at the price of a dozen eggs, that's equivalent to buying 3/4 of a pound of meat. Grams of protein to grams of protein. So when a dozen eggs only costs $2, that's like paying $1.50 a pound for ground beef or chicken thighs, etc. And so then I just costed it out for my students so that they could see that as each dollar increase in a dozen eggs, what that equivalent would be to buying meat. And personally, everybody has to make a decision about how much they want to spend on their eggs or whether they can find an alternative source of protein. Eggs are really a hard ingredient to kind of substitute out in so many recipes where they're a functional ingredient. But where I live, eggs definitely have gone up to about $13 a dozen. That's like paying $9 a pound for meat. And that would be twice as expensive as ground beef or 3 times as expensive as some of the chicken products that I can buy. So this really became an inspiration thinking about how students might not know how to make these comparisons as easily. And so that's kind of what set all of this in motion. So I have created a course that I'm teaching at UW called Let Us Talk Savings in the Kitchens. And we're trying to address the rising in food cost, help students and other people that are on limited budgets. We have high rates of food insecurity among many of our college students. So having them understand how they can save money on something that a lot of us spend a bulk, anywhere from 10 to 50% of your income can be spent on food, depending on what your circumstances are. But also, people are looking for alternatives to expensive dining out, how to shop so that it's more economical, how to be in your kitchen and find different ways to economize there. But what I like to do is I like grounding everything by going back in time to history. So I want to take us on a historical journey into home economics and actually my field of dietetics. And we're going to start here with going back about 120 years, thinking about the very first women that got together, and one gentleman that in between 1899 and 1908. And these 10 women, led by Ellen Swallow Richards, she was the first woman to graduate from MIT. She had a degree in chemistry. She was the first person to actually start applying the field of chemistry to human nutrition. But they got together and they held a yearly conference at Melville and Ann Dewey's. They had a health and wellness resort, kind of modeled after Kellogg's, his wellness resort out in the Midwest, the developer of Kellogg's cereal company. And they met over and over to eventually establish the American Home Economics Association in 1908. But the scandal around having Melville, the only man that was at these meetings, he was married to Ann Dewey, who was one of the women involved in this movement. But Melville Dewey was the father of the Dewey Decimal System, which we have in our school libraries and smaller community libraries often. And there were certain numbers that, were associated with different topics. It was very important to these women to make home economics grounded not only in research-based science, but to have it not trivialized. So they were really fascinated by where they would end up in the Dewey Decimal System. So they invited Melville and Ann to be part of the founding folks on this effort, because they were trying to make sure they didn't end up next to needlepoint in the Dewey Decimal System. They wanted to take over number 339, which actually was the topic of pauperism and is now the topic of macroeconomics. And eventually, home economics texts ended up in the 640s, which is the technology category. But the scandal here was that Melville Dewey actually ended up founding the American Library Association, but he got caught up in numerous scandals where he was sexually harassing young female librarians, and eventually not only did they kick him out of the home economics group, but the American Library Association kicked him out as well. So a little bit of scandal there. The American Dietetic Association was established by Lena Cooper, and she was part of these early meetings as well, and so that was established in 1917. Along that same time, the Smith-Lever Act of 1914 established that the land grant system of universities across the nation, every state has a land grant university, and this is where cooperative extension system is founded and kind of broadcast out to all of the different counties in any given state. But employment of home economics, home economists in schools and in communities was a huge deal. These were women that, as I said, were getting college and advanced degrees in home economics. And ironically, most of them were single and didn't have any children. Now, we're not sure whether or not they had cats, but they were the contemporary, they would be considered the big food influencers of their day-to-day. And ironically, most of their work was all kind of focused on the idea of saving manual labor and saving time and energy. And nowadays, we're all wearing smartwatches and counting our steps and trying to get more activity in. So we've seen a huge shift in how things look just 120 years later. But the government home economists were very much focused on thrift and saving. And that couldn't have happened at a better time, because this is basically when home economics really blossomed during economic hardship times, and the Great Depression being the first one. And they were super fortunate because the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt took all these new budding entrepreneurial women under her wing, and she used them to help the White House staff get cut by 25%. All of the food budgets got cut. She was relying on supplemental milk-based beverages that were developed by the Cornell Home Economy Labs. These group of home economists started what we now know as the free school lunch program, which ended up feeding 6 million undernourished children during the Great Depression. It also created 64,000 school-based jobs for people in kitchens. But the USDA Bureau of Home Economics was developed also to help people. They crafted all of these different economy food plans and food menus and recipes that used inexpensive ingredients and things that they could find locally. They also helped shape rural communities and gathered women and they loaned out food preservation like water bath canners and vacuum sealing canners in an effort to share the labor and share the resources. And so they would get these rural women together and they'd have these canning clubs. And this gave the women during hard economic times social and food benefits. So they really tried to make recipes that sounded very appetizing, but used limited ingredients. So there were things like depression cake that didn't have any eggs, sometimes no butter, sometimes no flour, etc. They were really very creative. They had mock apple pie that didn't have any apples in it. They found new uses for day-old bread, including using it as a ration filler, kind of like adding oatmeal or rice to ground beef to make extra meatloaf. So they were the face of economizing in the kitchen, and they really helped us get through those tough economic times. And then on the heels of that came World War II. And because we had this decade of downturn in the economics, when the military draft happened in 1940, a third of the young men failed their physicals because they were undernourished. And so President Roosevelt came out with all these different slogans like Food for Victory that were promoting the idea that the country needed to tighten its belt still longer and really help the effort to World War II. And this is when the very beginning of our idea of food groups came about. The government home economist came up with the basic 7, which actually was potatoes, grains and breads, dairy, proteins, butter and margarine, vegetables, and tomatoes and citrus. And so eventually that became the 4 food groups. And then after that, it became the food pyramid and my plate and other derivations. But butter and margarine is an interesting category to me because when margarine had been out for at least 40 years, I think, before World War II. But when it first came out, it was so disgusting of a product, people actually called it embalmed butter. And so if you just want to reflect on that, that's just really not appetizing to me. But this is also the time when we finally established the recommended dietary allowances. This let people know exactly what were the minimum amount of vitamins and minerals and other nutrients that people would need. And when they came in with the free lunch program, they adapted it to the RDAs to make sure that every child at school would at least 5 days a week meet that 1/3 daily requirement. They also supported the Victory Garden effort, and across the country, 40% of the vegetables consumed during World War II were grown in these 20 million personal gardens that home economists helped people start. And they also were crafting new recipes. This is about the time that ceramic cookware and things like Pyrex were coming in, because people were giving up all of their metal cookware that so that they could make munitions and military vehicles. And so Pyrex was a new thing, and you have to make some subtle cooking adaptations, just like when you cook at a higher elevation. So many of you may recognize this series of photos. This is Betty Crocker and her different, she was a fictional spokesperson for the Gold Medal Flour Company, and she had a radio show in the 1920s and 30s. Eventually, radio shows developed into what we now know as the Food Network and our modern social media trends. But Betty Crocker in the post-war era in the 1950s actually shifted to being another kind of not fictionalized name, but Betty Newton. So the Columbia Gas Company, and back in this time in the 1950s and 60s, the gas company was actually your appliance manufacturer. And there was a real push as natural gas and propane moved across the country as an energy supply to get people to buy these new appliances. And so they created a force of Betty Newton. So every single home economist, college educated, that made these home visits, they were going out into people's homes, women's homes, and teaching them how to use these new gas powered or different appliances. And they were teaching them how to use new convenience products, things like chipped beef in a plastic bag that you would boil on the stovetop. They were really about promoting consumer goods. And they were, again, continue to be this food influencers of their day. The Betty Newtons were making about 1 million personalized home visits. And while they were in the home, they were actually acting as the first corporate spies on America. And they would come back to the gas company and say, this is how they're using the equipment, and this is what they need, and these are how we should make these advances. And so, again, we had a wave of women out there in the field teaching these new ways to move through your kitchen. And so that is a fun kind of backdrop to this more relevant history. And then during the 1970s and into the 80s, home economics kind of, and this is when I came to home economics in the early 80s, they we were considered Becky Homeckies, and we were considered very dowdy, and we were considered to be too serious about the work, the unpaid labor of women in the home. And they basically closed a lot of home economics programs. The one at UW actually did get shuttered in the early 80s, and it moved to WSU, so that was where the land grant and the cooperative extension program was. So the field went through a rebranding and became Family and Consumer Sciences, and it broadened itself out so that it also encompassed social work, child development, apparel. So the original sewing classes and culinary labs or cooking labs became apparel sciences, and dietetics became human nutrition, all in an effort to kind of rebrand. And when it comes to rebranding with the nutrition side, this was really important because the American Dietetic Association, 100 years forward, basically it was became very scandalous in the 90s and the early aughts that the American Dietetic Association was in bed with McDonald's, Coca-Cola, the Grocery Manufacturing Association, the American Confectioners Association, think candy makers. And so they had to also go through a rebranding. And again, a lot of these home economic departments that moved into being Family and Consumer Sciences also kind of got away from a lot of the basic skill-based education. And so now into the future, we are finding that basically we have to go back to that. During the 2008 recession, during COVID, you remember everybody was making sourdough. People started economizing more. Backyard chickens are all the rage. I really feel bad for all the people that are getting backyard chickens right now because of egg prices, and they might not realize that it's going to take 6 months. We like to joke that the first egg you get out of your backyard chicken is called the $400 egg, because by then you've put in money into the coop and the supplies and the time and the resources, and that first egg you get is super precious. But we are entering a time of higher inflation rates and possibly increasing in food prices. And so knowing how to engage in these food preservation kind of classes and learning how to do things to make yourself more efficient and economy is all very, very important. And so we're also have a lot more digital influence in our lives. So whereas I think it's important to look back at the past and understand our history, also, it's time to embrace what technology can do for us and where we can find and share community-driven ways to save money. And so part of what I also am very fascinated by is how artificial intelligence programs can help us in the kitchen. And so basically, I wanted to give you that little bit as an example of what my talk would be like in my communication style. I will plan to possibly use poll everywhere or other open-ended discussions, depending on the audience size and where they are with technology and whether they want to do that or get in small groups, etc. But my goal here is to also generate community building. And so really thinking about how we can come together and share things that we learned growing up, share experiences that we're having now, strategies, looking at what's working, what's not, having some reflective ideas about what are the indulgences that we want to learn and continue to pay for, but then really thinking about what our goals are. I plan on having a wide variety because I'm an educator at the heart of handouts, resources, websites, video links, infographics, and whatever they want to take away. I will have that. I will be showing, as I said, some ways to use artificial intelligence to save money and craft recipes. And then at the end, again, I like to leave the presentation with this idea that we really need to come together as communities wherever we can and share these ideas and these resources and then pay it forward by teaching other people how to save money. And so the last slide I have here, I wanted to share. This is a project that I just did for my class where I grew, this is about $30 worth of Premier Gourmet mushrooms, blue oyster mushrooms, that I grew in recycled cat litter. It was fresh cat litter. It's made out of recycled newspaper, so it hasn't been urinated in. But these are mushrooms that you can grow for, let's see, I think I grew all of these for about $12 and I got about $30 worth of mushrooms out of them. So I have a bunch of ideas that I want to share with people and ways to do them. But that is kind of my talk in 23 minutes, and I appreciate your time, and I look forward to representing Washington Humanities. Thanks.